You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskins, your host. As always, this week we are talking urban design and the design review panel process. To have that conversation, I'm sitting down with Malcolm Mackay of Mackay Urban Designs. Malcolm is across probably more DRPs than anyone else in Western Australia, has a very extensive background in urban design, and can give us the context that we need today to understand the background of DRPs, what's happening in that design review panel space, the impact it's making, and some of the projects you've seen come through, not come through based on that, and the improvements that are being made. On top of that, we'll have a chat about Perth's urban design in general and how it stacks up across the world, how we operate, where our pinch points are, and what we value in urban design compared to other cities around the world. Malcolm, thanks so much for coming in, mate.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you for having me.
Look, you're on LinkedIn with your thoughts just as much as I am these days, and I have a big respect for the things you've been saying recently about how we do our urban design and how that is compared to developments across generations, centuries around the world. We're such an immature city when it comes to that space. How about you give us a bit of a flavour, if you can, for where you think Perth sits on the spectrum of urban design, and compare that to some of the cities around the world we might have travelled to?
That's a really interesting question, because Perth is quite different from a lot of other cities, and particularly those cities that do have a grand tradition when it comes to urban design. I'm often asked, what is urban design? Because there is no, as far as I know, there is no undergraduate course teaching urban design. It's something that you come to having done either architecture, planning, or it's a mix of everything. And I get myself into a lot of trouble, which I enjoy doing, and hence the LinkedIn posts, because I like stirring the pot. It stimulates debate, and that debate is what we need.
It's what we need in Perth right now.
Absolutely. Urban design is an umbrella discipline. It covers everything about the built environment, and that architecture, landscape architecture, planning are subsets of urban design. They sit under the umbrella. You may get a lot of comments from some of my colleagues about that one. They often see it the other way around. But the reality is urban design is about stepping back and looking at the bigger picture.
It's an outcome of all of those disciplines, right?
It is, absolutely. They're all required to create a good urban design outcome, and one discipline alone cannot deliver it, even if they think they can.
When describing Perth, I hear you use the word eclectic a lot. For me, eclectic means everyone has their own rules, no real theme to it, multi-cyclical, multi-generational, multi-style outcome when it comes to Perth. And look, to be honest, when you compare it to those major cities like Barcelona, like London, like Paris, you probably couldn't explain Perth in any other way than eclectic, could you?
No, and you're absolutely right. That is what makes Perth interesting in its own way. And as I said earlier, I kind of come from the grand tradition of urban design. I was brought up in the European tradition. I studied in the UK, worked in the UK and Europe a bit as well. And I travel extensively to Europe, because I just love European cities. It's my thing. But those cities are an urban environment. They date back hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. There's a grand tradition there of streets that are relatively tight, and buildings are sort of packed together. You can trace it back to an era where cities were defensive mechanisms, because they were regularly being looted and pillaged by the neighbours. That everyone walked, and therefore walkability was the driver, and hence the density of them. And their architecture was very much of that particular place, because it was derived from the relatively simple construction techniques that they knew and the materials that were available.
But there also seemed to be an ability, whether it was through the fiscal ability or through political ability, to put design first, even over practicality at the time. As you see, most of these cities wouldn't be approved these days the way they were approved those days when it comes to bushfire at risk or accessibility or servicing, all that. Whilst it seems like the beauty of these cities was paramount when they were designed.
It was certainly very important. There was two factors at play. One, they had a relative limited frame of reference. So they didn't have a planning system to start with, and they had a limited supply of materials, a limited amount of knowledge, and that lent a simplicity to everything. And there's a beauty that comes out of simplicity. The other aspect is that people's properties, and particularly for wealthier people, their property was their only way that they could show off their wealth. Maybe art, which was inside the property too. But they didn't have the cars or the yachts and all the other trappings that we have to display our status in life. And so a lot of measure was placed on the appearance of buildings.
Let's talk about the facades of some of these European buildings 500-600 years ago. The front facade of a building was a piece of art, a paintwork and a painting.
It was, and architecture was considered an art at that time. Here it's considered more of a science or a service these days, but it was very much an art. And interestingly, if you go back to sort of the Renaissance era in Europe, art and architecture were almost indistinguishable, and that the elevations of major buildings incorporated carvings and sculptures and works of art. They were integrated. These days, we pay 1% of the project value to the local government, and they erect a pile of steel. And there's a complete divorce between art and architecture, which is disappointing.
Yeah. Well, and look, that's where you start to move to the 21st century, where build costs are significant. We have to think about things like sustainability these days, and everyone's rooms are much larger with so much more amenities. So the buildings the homes we're building are far more expensive because they have far more in them as well. And it doesn't just sit in Perth, those limitations. I look at places in Europe these days where on one side of the street you would have this beautiful homogeneous neoclassical building. On the other side you've got a rice bubbles box that was built 10 years ago because of the cost. It's very functional, it's fantastic when it comes to that sustainability space, but it looks like a factory, and that is 50 apartments where people live and spend far more on their apartments than we do.
Yes, and therein kind of lies the irony, is that European cities are becoming more eclectic. And certainly, whilst they're sort of retaining their sort of historic core, when you go to the outskirts, they're looking increasingly like denser versions of Perth.
They're becoming more functional.
It's more functional and the modern way of life, but they are becoming more eclectic because there is a lot more choice. And I think that, getting back to Perth, I think that's one of the really interesting things about Perth, is that we have so much choice. We, as an architect here in Perth, you're not limited by one or two materials or one particular style that's evolved from the place. You've got the entire internet as your reference for how a building should look and work. I think Pinterest is probably the largest influence on architects now than anything else. And in the Perth context, that's not particularly unusual, because Perth has always been somewhat eclectic. We are a city predominantly of migrants, and we've got people that have come from the UK, or they've come from Italy, or all over the place, and they've brought with them their particular views on what architecture should be.
Their context, their preferences.
Their cultural context. And so Perth is, to some extent, a large melting pot of these cultural influences.
It's also the timing, right? You've got, I'd say, more than half of Perth's dwellings would have probably only been built in the last 30, 40 years. And if they weren't, something 100 years ago might be knocked down for that as well. We don't have a huge value on heritage in the same way that cities in Europe, for example, do, because most of the properties that you might consider heritage in Perth these days are small post-war cottages that would have far less amenity or value than the heritage we think about in Europe, which is maybe 300-400 years ago and part of a homogeneous design context. But at the same time, you look at places like St. George's Terrace and the heritage we've lost from that street by replacing it with significant brutalist office buildings is something that is quite sad at the same time.
I think it is sad. You could argue that that's progress, and so we have to accept that architecture goes through cycles and fashions like everything else. I think what then sits behind that is the question of, is it just fashion, or is there something more fundamental, and how do we get back to that notion of beauty rather than just being superficial? And a lot of the places that we think of as being beautiful places around the world have come about out of simplicity and out of a lack of choice. And the irony is that in having more choice here and having such an eclectic environment, we've lost the markers as to where beauty is and how do we deliver beauty. The irony is we could probably create a far more beautiful place if we turned around and said, you can only use these 3 materials.
We would have an identity.
20 or 30 years of development, you start to develop an identity. And if you look back at the areas that we consider as heritage areas, and particularly the inner suburbs, the buildings in there, they basically have 3 materials, and they have a consistency of proportions. There's a high degree of consistency between the buildings, and that is what lends them their particular character. So,
do you have any examples in Perth where you see significant urban design value that is being retained or should be retained?
Look, I think it's an ongoing debate about, particularly what people refer to as the heritage areas, those older suburbs. It's a real area of conflict because these are often the areas that are closer to the CBD and are the ones that are most suited to infill redevelopment, yet they're the ones that have the buildings that everybody loves because they have a beauty to them. I think for me, the real challenge is to say, well, they may be beautiful, but they're small and beautiful. Can we replace them with something that's large and beautiful? For me, that's the way forward, and we're not doing that. We're basically replacing these small, beautiful buildings with large, unappealing or soulless buildings, and the community is going, nah, don't like that, and we're not moving forwards. And for me, I think that's one of the ongoing challenges, and it's one that I've been pursuing particularly through the LinkedIn posts that I've been doing, and challenging this notion of beauty. If you talk to architects are taught in a funny way. To be a really good urban designer, you actually have to unlearn a lot of what you learn at architecture school. But architects are told that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's very subjective, doesn't really exist. And architects are encouraged to do their own thing. It's creative license to do your own things, which is fine. But when you have 30,000 architects all doing their own thing in the same place, you end up with something that's very inconsistent. It's as eclectic in its nature. So this eclecticism and this notion of beauty are at odds with each other. I think for me the real challenge then is how do we start to introduce the concept of beauty back into architecture and convince architects that beauty is something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of.
But it also comes down to practicality. I think if developers had an unlimited amount of money, or at least were incentivized some way through the planning system to be able to invest into beauty as well as form and function, then I think you would see more of it, because there is obviously a level of ownership and ego in the ability to build these beautiful landmark buildings. If there was a capacity through the feasibility of a development, whether it be through more open-ended height capacity, for example, where better yield would be available to be able to deliver more for the building's beauty, there would certainly be an opportunity, I think, for that outcome. However, we can segue to it soon. There are limitations in WA's planning system that require a developer to focus on simply delivering a product rather than delivering the most beautiful product they can. I don't think 300, 400, 500 years ago, given there wasn't much of a planning system, that was much of a restriction.
No, and I think you go back 300 or 400, 500 years, and beauty was instinctive. We all, as individuals, we can walk down the street and go, wow. None of us have been taught that. It's in us. It's innate. So there are some fundamental rules, and it's around proportion and simplicity and elegance and materials and visual interest and textures and colours. And so there is stuff that we can work with.
When I think about Perth's heritage, I look to town centres in places like Claremont, Fremantle, Bassendean, Midland, a little bit of Vic Park, but not a lot these days. There is some theme commonality in their localities with regards to the buildings that have remained, that still exist there. And I know that a lot of these local governments are at pains to look to try and keep a theme in the way that they build out the rest of the environment, in terms of the built form, in terms of the footpaths, the colour of the bins and the pavement and all that sort of stuff tries to still tie in with that. That's the limited history and urban design themes and commonality I think we have. The rest of it, for the most part, other than some parts within city mall, is suburban area that is your 4x2 or 3x1 brick and tile house that's been built in the last 40 years. There's not really a lot of urban design value in a lot of that, is there?
I think there is a lot of interest out there in being able to make it better, and I think it gets to the heart of what urban design is all about. I think it's significant that we now have 10 design principles enshrined in the planning framework. The first design principle is context and character, and that character is a really important word. The last principle on the list is aesthetics, which is what does it look like. So there is a strong interest in being able to create more appealing and more beautiful built environments. I just don't think collectively we have the skills to do it.
Well, you think about the way it's assessed, right? There are two pathways to have a development application approved. One is to meet a planning metric, and the other is to go down a design principles path. Now, as I understand it, if you develop a building that meets the planning metric of size mainly and function, then very little weight gets put on the design side. You pretty much get an automatic approval if your home is small enough and meets enough setbacks and has the amenity required. Then you don't have a lot of weight that is put from the assessing officer, who is a planner, not an architect, especially for single houses, especially for small scale development. A lot of this has no touch point with someone from a design background, does it?
It doesn't, and I think that's been one of my criticisms of the way things are produced in WA in the 30 years that I've been here, that it has been largely driven by the planning framework, which is essentially a suite of policies, and in some cases rules, but mostly policies, set a sort of a general envelope for what's deemed to be acceptable. But what's deemed to be acceptable last year isn't necessarily what's deemed to be acceptable this year, because society moves on. We have great expectations. The economy changes. Things change. But when we have had a planning framework that's really been creating things that are about convenience, utility, and avoidance of conflict, and there has been very little focus, on the quality of development. And I think that's where two main initiatives in the last decade, which have been really significant, have been the introduction of the 10 design principles, which is now the Bible for design in WA, but also the establishment of design review panels. For me, design review panels are probably the most important and most significant improvement in the planning framework, because it's now introduced design into the planning debate and into the process, where before it was all about, do you meet this list of provisions in
and
in
it
the
still
outcomes?
is in a way, right? There is still that pathway that if you meet the required minimum standards of setbacks and height and square meterage of bedrooms and outlooks and some natural ventilation and sunlight, then you don't really have to spend a lot of time worrying about design. That leads me to the next question, which some people would look at as red tape, but other people would look at as really beneficial, because I do see it as beneficial. As you've mentioned, we have design review panels these days. They sit across a lot of the larger projects. Would there be scope, would there be benefit to availing, having an ability for an opt-in even, if it was even just an option, for every building application, whether it was a single house all the way up to the apartment buildings that are already being subjected to a DRP, to have access to a design review panel if you wanted to pay for it, to get some expert advice?
Absolutely. I think that would be a fantastic initiative, and placing design foremost in people's minds. One of the issues here in Perth is we've never really developed a design culture. Design is something that people in black skivvies
and
turtlenecks do in a studio somewhere. When you go to other countries and even other cities in Australia, you go to Melbourne, for example, there is definitely a design culture in Melbourne and Adelaide as well, and it's growing in Brisbane. But you go to Europe, and there's a very, very strong design culture. You go to Japan, there's a very strong design culture. So I think that needs to be worked on, and anything we can do to improve that culture would be good. As far as buildings are concerned, yes, you're absolutely right. There's essentially two pathways through the planning framework. There's the deemed to comply, or the acceptable outcomes approach, which is basically you tick all of the boxes in the planning checklist, and hey presto, you get your approval. Or you do something interesting, more ambitious, more creative, but you refer back to the principles, and then something gets assessed against those principles.
More subjective.
It is more subjective, and that's where
DRPs would be valuable.
DRPs,
not planning officers.
Exactly, because you start to introduce the design discussion and debate.
Unfortunately, the situation is, whilst you can go down both pathways, at the front line in the local government area, it is still the planning officer who has no design background assessing you against one of the two pathways.
Yeah, and
doesn't seem correct to me.
No, and one of my and it highlights one of my favourite phrases, that mere compliance is not enough. And I keep meaning to get a T-shirt printed with that written on that I'll wear to design review panels. For me, that encapsulates that notion that yes, we have a planning framework that says, well, if you do all of these things, then that's acceptable. But it's actually not enough. What it does, the outcomes is not a manual for good design. It's merely just a checklist.
It's a control basis, really.
Yeah, and so you can have something that is completely compliant with the R codes, but you wouldn't want it built next door to your house. It's unappealing. And so mere compliance is not enough, and that design culture actually becomes really, really important. And that's where the value that design review panels can add in guiding people to a better designed outcome.
Let's talk about that value. I've been subject to quite a few DRPs these days across different cities, most of the time either through an apartment development or a childcare centre application. And I've definitely got experience from my side where we've seen considerable assistance from the DRP. Some people see it as a roadblock or a distraction, or why do these guys get to comment on it? They're not even going to give me an approval anyway. But I've learned to appreciate the value that the more consultative DRPs provide, because most of the people that are on these DRPs genuinely want to help provide better outcomes. They want to help the developer have a better outcome as well as the city. And a perfect example is my architect put forward a plan that I was amenable to, wasn't super excited about, but amenable to, with our childcare centre in Morley. That was sent to DRP because the City of Bayswater makes you go through a DRP, or maybe even 2 or 3 if you need a bit of a journey to get there. And I can genuinely say that we went from what was a fairly inefficient design, not to mention the design outcome of the aesthetics, to one that was far more efficient, even cost less to build, and looked better by the end of it because of the external assistance the experts in the DRP provided my architect who was working in his own silo at the time. I think that's a great example where a DRP can work together to provide everyone a better outcome.
And that's entirely consistent with all the feedback I've received. My partner Manera and I, we sit on around 20 DRPs between us. And so we see a lot of stuff come through the system, hundreds of projects a year coming through the system. We see where they start when they first come in, the advice that is then given, and we see what they look like when they to the end of the process. And the improvement is generally massive. You see a huge increase in the quality of design from start to finish.
It doesn't always mean extra cost, though, does it?
No, and I often argue that good design can actually be more cost-effective than bad design. One of the things that we see a lot is an architect picks up a project and they basically throw in everything they can possibly think of, because they've also always wanted to do one of these. And it's trying too hard, and it's got all sorts of bits stuck on it. And my mantra is elegant simplicity. And again, that goes back to my urban design roots and the interest in European urban design, where the buildings are very, very simple. They are elegantly proportioned. They don't shout. They all work collectively, and as a result, they're not expensive. So good design doesn't necessarily have to cost more, and in fact, good design could potentially be cheaper than a bad design.
Let's talk about these DRPs in a bit more detail. Firstly, when did they start coming on? When was the first DRP you sat on?
The first DRP I sat on, it's got a 2010 job number. I've been sitting on them for 13 years now.
So it's been around for a while. Talk us through the makeup of these DRPs, who sits on them, what happens. For someone who's never been to a DRP before, who's nervous about it, it's coming up in 2 weeks, can you give us a bit of a walkthrough to how it goes for that applicant?
Some of them have been around for a long time. I think the longest standing ones are South Perth and Cottesloe from memory. They've been around for decades. There was a huge change in the middle 20-teens when the Design WA suite of documents came out, and that as part of that, state government started encouraging local governments to have design review panels, and so the number of them has grown exponentially in the last 7 or 8 years.
There are cities that have only just adopted it in the last year.
Absolutely,
as well.
Yeah, and there's
some
still
pretty big cities,
and there's still some local governments who don't have a DRP and are still thinking about it, and I'm sure they'll get there in the end. And I'm of the view that every local government should have access to a design review panel, because I have seen the benefits that they deliver. So a design review panel is generally made up of a selection of design experts. They're predominantly architects. I'm of the view that a panel that's made up of all of architects isn't as effective as one that has other disciplines on it as well, because with my urban design heritage and this belief that urban design is this umbrella about the whole of the built environment, it needs to consider landscaping, engineering, sustainability, and they vary from panel to panel. So and they all work slightly differently, and I think that's fine because every place is different.
Are they political?
They're not political generally.
Who appoints the panel members?
The panel members are appointed by the local government.
So they could be handpicked by a politically biased local government.
Yes, and look, there has been one example that I know of. I'm not going to mention names, but there is one example that I know of where there has been arguably some political interference in that. But I think, as a general rule, they're not political.
I bet I could guess what that city was, Malcolm. We won't talk about it.
No
surprises.
No, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
I think we both know where that is.
Yeah.
In general, they're not political. A transparent selection process. There's criteria.
And I guess most people on that panel would have a level of pride about the idea that they are independent.
Fiercely independent. I make it perfectly clear that my opinions are viewed without fear or favour. That I will, as a design review panel member, I will tell you what I think. And honesty is a really important part of it. And the feedback I've had from applicants is that they really appreciate the honesty, because it has saved them a fortune in some cases, that they've actually heard what they've suspected but about their design, but to hear it from someone other than their own architect, to hear it coming from someone else, they've gone, yeah, no, this isn't a great way of moving forwards on the design. Let's do something different.
Are DRPs an environment where it's quite consultative, where you can have frank conversations, or do you sit there, listen to the DRP, and then you go home without an opportunity to actually ask real questions and get real value that you might be seeking yourself? Is it a stuffy environment, or is it a quite a relaxed environment?
To be honest, it varies from panel to panel. Some of the panels and some of the panel members follow more of a process. It's a bit more formal in the way it happens, and they tend to provide comments rather than engage in discussion. And in some cases, some members are reluctant to suggest design improvements. They just provide comments and leave people to figure out what that actually means. I have a completely different view on that. My view is that it's really important for panels to provide the best guidance that they possibly
provide
can.
Solutions, not problems.
And we're not there to tell people how to redesign their buildings, but if we see an idea, if we think of an idea that could be done, by all means suggest it and say, look, you don't have to do this, but here's something that you might want to consider.
Are they expensive processes to go through? Does the applicant pay for it?
Again, it varies from local government to local government. Some local governments charge for it. Some offer it for free.
My experience is it's a few $100s to $1,000, something like that. It's not a huge impost on a project. You get a lot of value for money. Put it this way, if I had to have an hour of Malcolm Mackay's time, I'd probably be paying that straight away anyway.
And you're not just getting my time. You're getting
5 people.
You're getting potentially up to 5 people giving you that advice as well. So it is a very cost-effective way. And again, applicants appreciate that they're getting very cost-effective advice.
To drill back down to it again, the DRP is assessing your application from a design perspective. They are not giving an approval or a refusal. They're giving commentary and recommendations on design, and they're working to across the 10 principles, right? So the response, the feedback that you would get normally that I've received is a letter that would have a table with 10 rows and a traffic light system that would have a red, green, or an orange against it. Is that how it always works?
Again, it varies from panel to panel. They all operate slightly differently. But in these days, I think certainly all the panels that I sit on, everything now is geared around the 10 principles of SPP7. I was a little bit skeptical, I admit, at first when that first came in, because I tended to operate on strengths and weaknesses. But in these days, I tend to use the 10 principles. I find them a very convenient way to review things, but also it's become a useful standard in engaging with the planning framework and then ultimately with the decision makers. So we're all on the same page when we talk about the 10 principles.
Is it imperative to leave the DRP with 10 green ticks? Is it a necessity to get those ticks for an approval from the planners? And does getting those 10 ticks mean you'll automatically get an approval?
It's an interesting question. I personally hate the traffic light system. And I've argued for years that we should get rid of the traffic light system.
But the planners don't understand it. They need to consume it in some way as well, right?
Yeah, to be honest, in all of the DRPs that I sit on, I've seen 10 greens only a handful of times. So the answer is no. You don't necessarily have to have 3 greens. I think the important thing is, from a design review panel's perspective, have you enabled the project to be the best version of itself that it can possibly be?
So we're not seeking perfection.
We're not seeking perfection, and I think there's a danger in the design review panel process of assuming that every project can be brought to the level of a Pritzker Prize winner and be on the cover of international architectural magazines.
That's not the threshold.
That's not the threshold. There's a threshold of pushing people as far as they can reasonably go. Now, when we see extremely talented architects come through the DRP system, and Perth does have some really, really good architects, they will end up producing an exceptional piece of work. We see other people come through the system that might be a couple of years out of drafting college and are really at the very beginning of their careers and perhaps a little bit out of their depth. And we help to get them as far as they can possibly get. But we know that they're not going to win architectural awards at the end of it, but they will deliver a building that's at least acceptable. And so it's horses for courses. But we're always pushing as far as we can, but not pushing people too far, expecting something that can't be achieved.
Okay, so it's there as a guiding, assisting, value add process, but it's not a stage gate where if you can't get through the DRP, you can't get an approval. It's supposed to support the application rather than be one that is controlling an ability to get approved in the first place.
Yes, I think that's a fair summary. And look, when you look at the decision-making process, when something gets to the council or to the JDAP, there's a huge range of things to take into consideration. You've got the aims and objectives of the planning scheme. You've got all the principles in the planning policies. You've got the clause 67 provisions, of which there's about 30 of them, of which design is just one element, and obviously for me it's a very important element, but it is only one element, and the decision makers are looking at other things as well. In fact, that's for me, that was one of the reasons why I was so frustrated as a JDAP member. I spent 4 years as a JDAP member, but for me, being a decision maker, you were at the end of the process. Design was just a small component of it, and I found myself in the position where I was looking at something that was consistent with the planning framework. It might have been an ugly building that I didn't like the look of, and I could see heaps of scope for improvement, but there really was, by that point, there was no opportunity to change it and improvement, which I found frustrating. And then that's why I moved more into design review panel area, because you do get a chance to get in early at the beginning of the process, help people, and
influence
the outcomes and improve the quality of design.
Well, let's go overarching now to how Perth might improve its outcomes. There's a couple of themes that we've recognised in our conversations outside this podcast that seem to be quite unique to Perth in a way, and maybe holding us back from having the best outcomes, the best design, and also solving what is our largest problem, our most critical problem right now, housing supply. We've been at the forefront of recognising a couple of things. One, a pathological pushback on height in Western Australia in certain areas, but also a requirement that once you receive height, there is some sort of setting back of levels once you get to a certain space, which you've called the cake layer effect, which has so many impacts on design and functionality and waterproofing and all these sort of things. Do we see this sort of pushback across the rest of the world when it comes to height? And do we see similar solutions to ameliorating height around the world as well? And is this what's holding us back from truly having a beautiful, modern, functional, mobile property market? And finally, I know many questions in here, is it inevitability anyway? Is it just something we're all going to have to accept? Height is coming because it's all the way around the world the only solution, unless you want to continue to broaden your city.
Yes, in WA, there is an unholy obsession with height, and people are terrified of height. Apparently there is a word for it. It's called batophobia, which is the fear of tall things. It is evident here. It's not as bad as it used to be. I think as a society we are changing, and we are becoming more acceptance of height in particular locations and in particular forms. The ability to go up as a designer actually enables you to create better design outcomes. What we have here is we put restrictions on height, and then we put restrictions on setbacks, and when you put
plot ratio
and plot ratio and restrictions, and if we go back to that sort of grand European tradition that I started with, the normal approach to designing a site is that you build up to the street. So your building becomes part of the wall of the street, the containment of the street. And the streets they're our spaces. They're the public realm. They belong to all of us. They're the places where we engage with each other. And so what you're doing as an architect, as a designer, is providing part of the wall of that space. We build boundary to boundary. So our building rubs shoulders.
Think of Notting Hill. I'm thinking of Notting Hill right now.
You can think of any European city. And that means that you use the lot very efficiently. And it means you don't have to go to the back of the lot, because if you can go to the sides, you don't have to go to the back. And if you don't go to the back, you can have a garden at the back, which means that you can put trees and grow vegetables and do all of the other good green things that are important in a city. And then what the height allows you to do is to get to the yield that you need for it to be a viable project.
And a good quality project.
But without sacrificing the landscape at the back. But what we do here is we squash buildings down with a height limit, which means when you squash them down, it's a bit like squashing a lump of jelly down. It just goes sideways, and so it spreads out.
See you later, trees.
And so we lose all of the green. We lose the green space, and we press up against the boundary, and then we have the privacy issues associated with building to the boundary. Whereas going up enables us to avoid those problems. As to why height is an issue in WA, I think it's because most people in WA, and particularly those who were born and brought up here, were brought up in a suburban environment. And so the suburban environment becomes the benchmark for everything else.
People don't like change.
And the thing about Perth and WA generally, people here is they like what they know, and they know what they like. And so if you've been brought up in a suburban environment, it's what you're used to. That becomes your benchmark for everything else. And therefore, creating an urban environment is weird. It's a bit strange, and unless you've
intrusive,
traveled,
nearly.
yeah, and unless you've travelled extensively and experienced European cities and older cities around the world, you don't really understand how it works. So I think that's one of the cultural issues that we have to get over, and a lot of that is embedded in the planning framework as well. So the R codes and other planning policies are all derived from that
bias.
That bias towards a suburban environment. And so a lot of the planning framework is sort of saying, well, how can we create an urban environment without creating an urban environment? And we end up with something that's neither fish nor fowl. And I think that's very much a hallmark of a lot of development in WA, both out in the fringe and in the inner area, that we're scared to do urban. We can't afford to do suburban anymore, and we're just doing this sort of hybrid that's neither one thing nor the other.
So will it be an inevitability that one day, whether we like it or not, as a society, we're just going to have to build up?
I think we're going to have to build up.
We're always going to have to get used to it and suck it up.
Yes, and things will change. And I think younger generations are more aware of the world around them. They're more aware of sustainability issues, and that the city can't just keep expanding forever and ever out into the bush. We do have to go up. Now, for me, the really interesting question is then, how do we go up? Because at the moment, and you talked about the challenges we face at the moment with housing affordability and construction costs and the like, is that it's very, very difficult to go up in a mid-rise form of development, that they just don't seem to be stacking up. And the mid-rise form of development, and that's that sort of 3 to 6 stories.
It doesn't stack up. Build costs are too high.
It doesn't work, and that's the grand European tradition.
The only way you could possibly make it stack up is more height, and even that might still not be enough with the cost of construction right now.
So I think if we're stuck with those constraints of construction prices and viability, then and knowing that we do have to keep going up, then I think the way in which we go up will change. And I think what we will see more of are tall tower developments on larger sites rather than mid-rise development on single.
Well, that seems to be where the least friction is, right? It seems like it's easier for Paul Blackburn to get a 25-story apartment built in a zone that had been allowed for 10 or 13 or 15, because he can give back to the local realm on the ground floor with some marketplace or some greenery, rather than your small-time developer trying to build 4 stories on a block that's zoned for 3.
I think you're right. It is easier to do as long as you're doing it in the right place. And then I think what becomes critical is then identifying where are the places around the Perth metropolitan area where those, the hyperdensity, the really tall towers and the larger density is most appropriate. Around the Perth CBD, within significant activity centres, next to railway stations, important railway stations. That becomes a challenge, is how do you distribute density in that manner, rather than this assumption that we can somehow roll R60, R80, R100 across large areas and expect the market to deliver it when it can't.
Well, you think about that zoning and you apply it to a Paris, for example. The whole of Paris is essentially an R100 site. No higher, no shorter.
Yeah, and everything in the WA context is suggesting that we're going to struggle to do that, and that being able to deliver the grand tradition of urban design in the Perth context is sadly unrealistic.
Well, it's unrealistic for a couple of reasons. One, the staged nature of development, and therefore the staged nature of zoning and how it continues to slowly get more dense over time. So you'll have buildings that are 20 years old that are capped out at 5 stories, and the one next to it will have a zoning for 8 stories and it will cap out there, and so on and so forth over the next 100 years. And maybe that building's still there in 100 years, maybe it's not. But also the opportunity in Perth where you could be in an R80 zone and still build a 1-story house. No one's stopping you.
Yes, and so we end up with I think you used the phrase eclectic at the beginning, and that will continue that grand tradition of eclecticism that's endemic in the Perth environment, which, as I said, makes things interesting. For me, though, I think the one thing that is really exciting as an opportunity, and which has the ability to pull it all together, is landscape. And for me, this has probably been the most significant revelation out of the whole design review panel process, is that if you get good input from a landscape architect early on in a project and introduce landscape as an integral part of the design solution, that landscape can help to create a consistent character to a place. We end up with a street that is heavily landscaped, whether it's in the verge and street trees, in the front setback, on the balconies, that starts to mitigate against the eclecticism of the architecture and hold it together.
So what you're saying is the landscaping becomes the commonality, the common theme across the city.
Exactly.
And look, there is an opportunity there, right? And you don't have to spend significant money to do that. I remember driving through Milan last year and seeing what would have been a 15-story charcoal-coloured box. But the difference with it that made it stand out, that it was actually quite beautiful, is that wrapped around that charcoal box that had no architectural features on it whatsoever. But the architectural feature that came out of it was pretty much a total encompassing of a meshed greenery that wrapped around it. And you look at it and go, that actually wouldn't have been that expensive to build, but it looks really quite lovely to experience from afar.
Yeah, and I think, as far as bang for your bucks is concerned, landscape is a pretty good tool to achieve it. Getting back to this original question about what is the future of Perth and its character, I think landscape is a fundamental part of it. It rings a bell with me because when we travel overseas and we talk to other people, and particularly people who have been to Perth at some point in the past, they always comment on the landscape qualities of Perth, and their fondest memory is of Kings Park, and they talk about the beautiful tree-lined streets and a climate where stuff grows.
Well, it would be a big difference because currently we are the worst city in Australia for that performance.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of debate around that at the moment. And a lot of that debate is around keeping existing vegetation where you're having redevelopment. I have a slightly different view on that.
So do I.
And my view is that if we're transitioning from a suburban environment to an urban environment, then the landscape task goes from the back of the lot to the public realm. And it's our streets and our parks, but particularly our streets, where we have the greatest opportunity to introduce landscape in a manner where the landscape can be seen and appreciated by everybody. So we're not talking about a tree 50 metres away from the street at the back of the lot that 3 residents will see. We're talking about a tree in the verge that thousands of people will see every day. So I just have this vision for Perth in the future as this most amazing garden city on a whole new scale, and that also resonates with my observations as a design review panel member. In recent years, there are 10 design principles in SPP7. There are 3 design principles that are being consistently focused on as the areas where people need to work harder and where there is more opportunity to improve. And that is context and character. And I think landscape is an enormous contributor to character. Landscape quality speaks for itself. And the third one that's being pushed very heavily is sustainability.
No surprises.
And again, landscape is an important part of sustainability.
So it's nearly an easy way to get a few wins there is to focus on the landscaping quality, and you might get 3 green ticks already.
It would certainly help, and I say it all the time in design review panels that if you haven't got a landscape architect on board yet, get one on board.
Seems like a booming industry. 10 years ago, it didn't exist. Now you can't get one for weeks.
Yeah, the market will adjust to meet the demand, but it is an integral part of the design process.
Malcolm Mackay, it's been a fantastic chat about urban design in Western Australia. There's obviously a lot of limitations at the moment that are holding us back in the planning space, but hopefully the design space is able to continue to come to the fore and allow us to look back in 20, 30, 50 years at how beautiful our city has become.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to shoot the breeze on it.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!